All right, so to get into building the shader, it's really a matter of, first understanding some basics about the MIA material, since that's what we're going to be using. Um, and once you sort of figure out or understand how to make a shader for a branch or a leaf, in regards to how to set up translucency and reflectivity and whatnot, making it for all the other ones is a matter of just taking, one of the shaders you already made for a leaf, duplicating it, and then changing the leaf texture that's used for a different kind of plant, and adjusting the specular properties. Generally, that would be the things you would change because some leaves are shinier than others. So we're not going to go and, we don't need to have all of these visible while we do this. So I think the first thing to do is decide which ones we want to start with and take a look at. Now, be aware that with some of these plants, let's say like this one, again, there's no alpha channel being used for it. While if we look around at some of these other ones, let's say like the ivy that's in here, let's sort of zoom in on that, we can see that does have an alpha channel for the ivy leaf, as does this one here. So actually this one you can see is not using an alpha channel. So the shape of the leaf geometry is sort of all it needs to be. So we should pick one that has transparency, just so that you sort of understand how transparency works as we're going to need to use it. So I think that this one here looks like that's an option. Or maybe what we'll do is let's actually use both of these rows. So we'll have a couple visible. So the rubber plant and the shrub mesh. So everything else I'm just going to hide for now. And let's go and hide those as well. So this is what we'll focus on. And for these, there's obviously a bunch of them in here, which doesn't particularly matter. Let me actually get the ground plane geometry back. It'll obviously slow down rendering a little bit, so maybe I'll end up deciding to delete some of them. So, but let's say we've got this as a start point. Now, to evaluate shaders for things, it's really a good idea to use the mental ray sun and sky, because it just makes your life easy. You get a big sky dome that can be used with final gather, and you get a directional light that you can easily rotate for your sun position. And so that's what we're going to use for our lighting setup to begin discussing this. And also I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this brush group, let's say to there, just so that we have both plants inside here. So let's say something like this is potentially how we'll start evaluating. And maybe we'll lower the camera down a little bit as well. And maybe I'll save this camera view. So I'm going to select the camera and just hit S to set a keyframe. It's an easy way to save your camera view, because if I tumble, I can just go back to frame 1. So I already created directional light in here. I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to go to our render settings. I'm going to go to indirect lighting, and I'm going to go to physical sun and sky. And when I create that, and then just close everything, what we'll see inside here is we have a directional light for the sun. So I'm going to take this light and just scoot it there. Let's go back to frame 1. And as you should know with directional lights, the position of the light doesn't change the angle, and the scale of the light is irrelevant. So I'm just going to go and, let's say, position the light like so, just for now. So with this, again, we still have the default shaders on our objects. So if we do a render, we're not going to get something that looks very good. And if I go to render settings, you'll see that when you create the physical sun and sky, it turns on final gather. The default settings for now are okay. And also our quality right now is set to 1, which is where we set it earlier. And our ray tracing settings are all at the defaults. And as we generate the shader that we're going to want to use for this, we're going to end up having to make some changes, specifically inside here, just because of the number of reflections or refraction as well, because that's how translucency is handled with the MIA material, and the trace depth for being able to make sure that the shading is transferring its information through all the leaves. But first let's just do a render just so we have a start point. So I'm going to just render this out the way it is. So that was the final gather pass. All right. And let's save the image. So this is our start point. So we'll see that we get something that obviously looks like plants, but it could be a lot better as far as the shading. And especially you can see that there's some funky stuff going on inside here with those leaves. And but the good thing is that we have this blue environment inside here, and so we can see that that's, you know, giving us nice shadows. The default sun or directional light when you use physical sun and sky has the shadow softness set to 1, so you can see the shadow is harder near the object and gets a little softer as it gets further away, since the sun is not a perfect point in the sky, so you're not getting those razor sharp shadows. So let's go in now and go to Hypershade. So what I want to do in here as a start point is let's select, let's say, one of our pieces in here from the rubber plant, that. And let's go and graph it. So we can see that it has this ramp. So it's a ramp that's being multiplied by another ramp to create some color. So this ramp, you can see, has repeats on it. So it's being repeated a bunch of times and has a little bit of a noise pattern in it. So it's procedural. For something far away, it might be okay. But again, we don't want to use this shader. So we want to switch to an MIA material. So if I go to Mental Ray, we're going to use the MIA Material X shader. And so I'm going to click and create one of those. And then in here for that, if I wanted to basically use what PaintFX did as a start point, I can very easily just be like, well, I'll maybe use the same color. You can see it's only going into color. And I can drag that into my MIA material and put that into, if I choose default, you're going to see that it's going to go into the color as well. So if I double click on that, our color is currently textured. So if I now select that, I'll then go and assign it in Hypershade. And so let's go and find that MIA material I just created, which is right here. I'll assign it. Let's graph it. So again, you can see it's assigned to that object. And this is the rubber plant. So I'm going to double click and I'll call it rubber plant. So you're going to want to take the time, obviously, as you build this shader library to, you know, name things as they correlate to the different PaintFX preset brushes. So rubber plant, MIA, hit OK. So that right there is a default MIA material. So all of the settings inside here are just the default settings. Not going to make any changes for now. Let's now go and grab the texture that's on the leaves of the rubber plant, or the shader. Let's graph that. So this is the one that doesn't have an alpha channel. I'm going to go and create a Mental Ray Material X. Connect that to diffuse. And I will name that one. So that's my rubber plant leaf MIA. Hit OK. And to assign it to whatever that's assigned to, I can right-click, select objects with material, right-click, assign. So I just changed the assignment there. So that's now on there. So if I select that leaf, and let's say I choose to select materials from objects, we can see that that MIA material is now assigned to that leaf. So now we're going to go do the same thing over here. Graph it. We can see that for the shrub mesh, the branches are assigned something that has a file texture, which we can see is coming from the brush images folder, which is being multiplied by a ramp to give it some color. And we'll use that as a start point. It's fine. So same thing. Let's put that to diffuse. Let's select objects with that material and assign that material. So now that's been done. And so we can see in here, again, to confirm, If I grab the twigs, select materials from objects, you can see it's that material. I didn't name it, so let's call that the shrub mesh branch MIA. And then finally, the leaves there. This leaf, you can see, has an alpha channel on it. And so for this, it's not as simple as just dragging this color map to repurpose it. What we have is a file texture that's being multiplied by a ramp. So you can see the out color of the file texture is going into the color gain. So if we go into the ramp and go to color balance, the color gain is mapped. So again, that makes one texture multiply by the other. So, excuse me, this ramp, all it's doing is adding a little bit of color. The top is white, so it's having no effect, but the bottom is a little bit, cool, so it's just changing the color. It's incredibly subtle, so you could call it irrelevant if you wanted to, but we can still keep it. So, mental ray material X. But aside from the mapping that's going on there, you'll see that the color is mapped to color. So the out color of the ramp is going to the shader color. But here you'll see out transparency from this file texture is going to the transparency on the shader. And that's because this file texture has an alpha channel. And so the file texture already has an alpha channel that is for transparency. So this image is a RGBA image. And so that's a very simple way to create textures for leaves if you're creating one in Photoshop or whatever, is just put the mask into the alpha channel, and then you just have a single image to deal with instead of two. But the thing is that if you go to the MIA material, it does have, if we go inside here and you start looking around, you'll see you have color and you have reflectivity, you have your refraction settings, and then you'll see there's transparency. So you might think that that's where it goes, but it doesn't. And the reason has to do with the fact that we're going to be using transparency with the MIA material for translucency. So this could get a little confusing the first time you do it. So what we're going to do to create the shrub mesh leaf, so shrub mesh leaf MIA, is first let's grab the color and we'll just map that to diffuse. Then let's select that object and assign this shader to it. And so clearly what we're going to see now in here is that it doesn't have an alpha channel anymore. So you'll see it's rendering, or showing at least in hardware, with this black outline, which we want to get rid of. And so in here, where does that go? Well, basically what you need to do is you still want to use the out transparency, but instead of putting it into the transparency, let's just close everything out. Instead of putting this into transparency and refraction, if you go to the advanced settings for the MIA material, you'll see something called cutout opacity. And that's really, really useful because if you take the transparency map for this, which is just a black and white image, and you put that into cutout opacity, it'll just cut out part of the surface so that you don't see it. And it cuts out not only the diffuse, but it also cuts out the specularity and the reflection. So that's really, really useful, because otherwise if you did it in a more traditional way where you're cutting out, let's say like the way this Maya shader is done, where you're making transparency, you still will end up getting specular highlights in the areas that are transparent unless you also adjust your specular map. So with the cutout opacity, you don't need to do that. So, but there's a couple things that you need to know to get this to work. You need to first understand that the way cutout opacity works is the opposite of transparency as far as values. So with transparency, a value of white is going to make something transparent. So while with cutout opacity, it's the opposite. So I need to take the alpha channel and I have to flip it. I need to invert it to use it as the cutout opacity on the MIA material. So to do that, I'm going to go to Maya. And then in here, I want to go to Utilities. And in Utilities, there's going to be the reverse utility right there. So very simple, just take your out transparency and map it to the reverse utility. So if I middle mouse button drag and go to Other, in here, first of all, for things we're going to be doing, make sure that your left display shows hidden and your right display shows hidden. This is just to make sure that all of the input and output possibilities are listed. Then I'm going to go in here and find out transparency and connect that to the input on the reverse utility. So now that's connected. But then the out transparency in here going into the reverse utility is creating a sort of vector RGB value. But the cutout opacity on your MIA material is a float value, just a single number, not 3 numbers. So what I'm going to also do in here is get a luminance node. And so if we look inside here, what the luminance node will do is take a vector and convert it into a float. So basically RGB to grayscale. So grab that. That's going to be just the default input. So you can see output is going to value. And then this can plug into the cutout opacity on the shader. Go in here, go to Other. The out value of luminance, scroll down to the bottom, goes to cutout opacity right there. And now it's connected correctly. So if I select objects with that material, you're going to see it's selecting all the leaves. If I now close Hypershade, you'll see we're still going to get the black outline just because our hardware display, hardware texturing, isn't recognizing the cutout opacity, but it is going to work. So we've now created an MIA material that is assigned for the rubber plant branch, the leaves, and the shrub branch and the shrub leaves. So if I go and select that, go to the attribute editor, you can see this has rubber plant MIA, rubber plant leaf MIA, shrub branch MIA, and shrub branch leaf MIA. So these are just using the same maps that PaintFX created, which obviously are easily swapped with your own textures. This one, no transparency, and this one has transparency via cutout opacity. So let's go and save our scene as 03, just save as we go. Let's open the render view window. This is what we had from before. Now we're going to do another render. And so let me just first go in here and make sure that I saved this render, and then do another one. Now all of the settings on the MIA materials are default. So basically we have a bit of work we need to do to improve it. You'll see that the transparency is working on the leaves inside here. So we are getting the transparency mapped leaves. So that's because we use the cutout opacity. So if we now go inside here and compare, this is what we got with the Phong materials from Maya. This is what we're getting now. So it already looks a little bit better, and the reason just has to do with the way that the reflectivity is being handled. And so you'll see that a MIA material is really optimized for reflections, and specifically glossy reflections. So if you look at this bush right here, and as I swap between them, you can see already it's feeling a little bit more natural just because of the way it's picking up the blue from the sky. So we're just now going to want to talk about some of the settings you may want to change based on different types of plant materials you're creating. So that's going to have to do, let's go inside here. Let's go to the MIA material. So again, quick way to go to the shader for it is select something. I open the attribute editor. I just use a hotkey, Control A, and then I can just go and grab the shader right there. So we have a bunch of attributes we're going to want to talk about. And so we've already used cutout opacity, but there's also issues having to do with bump, ambient occlusion, indirect illumination from final gather, the way translucency is handled, which we're going to need, the way reflectivity falls off based on angle, anisotropy, maybe certain plants or leaves would need that. In our case, we can probably live without it. So this is something that, as you can see in the preview up here, is going to basically stretch that highlight as if that object is covered with lots of little grooves. So certain leaves might be structured that way, but We don't need to worry about that. Refraction, which is where we're going to be setting up our translucency. As translucency with the MIA is handled through transparency. And then, of course, our reflectivity, which right now you can see is creating extremely glossy reflections, meaning the reflections are not blurred, they're in focus. So I'm just going to save this scene. We just did another render test, and now let's start talking about changes we need to make to the MIA material. But before we go into the MIA material, there is one thing that I need to point out, which would generally be, I would have done already, but I just sort of didn't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, is when looking at these renders, which look fine, you may notice that well, you wouldn't know unless you knew what the textures looked like, but let's specifically take a look at what the textures look like in hardware and what they look like in the render. You'll see that the green that are in these leaves feels a lot more saturated and a lot more rich than what we're seeing in the render. Now, you might think that that just has to do with the fact that there's all this blue, bright light coming in through Final Gather, but it actually has to do with an issue pertaining to gamma. And since we're using the physical sun and sky, basically what we need to do is realize that there's gamma correction happening on our textures. And so, or rather, it's not gamma correcting our textures. So the textures are getting washed out. So for anybody who's done or used physical sun and sky or exposure nodes before on their cameras, you know what I'm about to get into. But basically, we have to gamma correct our textures. So if I go into my scene and I select our camera and go to the attribute editor, you'll see that by creating in our render settings the physical sun and sky, our camera is now connected to a exposure node. And so inside here you'll see that on your camera, if you go into mental array, there is an environment shader, which is the physical sky, and a lens shader, which is the exposure simple. So the exposure simple has controls to adjust the exposure of the image for the render, as well as the gamma setting. And the physical sky has settings having to do with the color of the sky, haze, ground color, night color, sun direction, and so forth. And what we're going to want to do inside here is make a couple adjustments, as well as adjustments to our textures. The first thing is I prefer the photographic exposure node to the exposure simple node, because I actually think that the photographic one is simpler to use. Meaning that the terms that are used in here, if you know anything about cameras, are a little bit more intuitive. So first I'm going to get rid of the exposure node and swap it with something else. And so the way I'm going to do that is if I, let's say, go inside here and go to hypergraph connections, then I can see, if I look inside here, that my MIA exposure node and the physical sky node are connected inside here to my camera, as you can see. And so that's the first thing that I'm going to want to adjust. We can also see that our sun, this directional light, is connected as well to the physical sky node. And so if I go to the attribute editor, you can see it needs to know which light is being used as the sun. So this is the node that I want to replace. So if I go to Hypershade, what I'm going to do is go to Mental Ray. If I go to Lenses, inside here you'll see MIA Exposure Photographic. And I'm going to create that. And by creating it, let's close this, you'll see it just popped up in here with my connections. And so what I can do is basically look in my scene. Let's just move some stuff out of the way. Just moving things around. Let's make this a little bigger. So the exposure simple node is outputting to the sky and the camera. So if I'm going to swap this one with this one, I just need to break these connections and create the same connections with this node. So if I look, I can see the exposure simple node .message is connected to the lens shader. So if I select that and hit delete and middle mouse button drag and say default, you'll see it created the same connection, .message to .lens shader. So that's easy. And then this one is connected to dot message to mi sky exposure. So if I delete that, select and hit delete, drag that and hit default, it doesn't know what I want. And so, but since I saw what the connections were, I can say message is going to mi sky exposure. And these would not appear by default unless you had show hidden checked. So that's where show hidden is important. So now that I've swapped out with the photographic node, I can select the exposure simple node and just delete it. So if I now select my camera inside here and map it, I can see that this exposure photographic node is connected to the camera and the physical sky. So if I select that node and go to the attribute editor for it, you'll see it has more attributes than the exposure simple did. But if you know anything about camera, you should recognize things like ISO, camera shutter, f-stop, and then vignetting, and these attributes are more for style. So we can do a render test with it, but vignetting is going to make things a little darker at the edges. Burning the highlights is going to be kind of like if you went in Photoshop with the levels tool and took the slider on the right side for the brights and brought it into the left, you're kind of burning out the highlights. This would be the same thing. You're crushing the blacks. You're taking the blacks and making them blacker, which makes things look a little bit more like they're exposed on film, where you have the limited dynamic range that film captures. And so to create a more photographic look, a lot of these kinds of things, burning highlights, crushing blacks, vignetting, are things you might do in post in Photoshop or your compositing package. It just allows you to get a start on that in your actual render. So if I go into the render view window and save that last render, and now we do another one, it's going to look similar. There's just going to be a difference in the way the exposure handle looks. And what I'll see first, the image rendered black. Why did that happen? That's because if we go back to the connection editor inside here, let's grab the camera, map it. With our physical sky node that's on the camera, when you adjust from exposure simple to exposure photographic, you have to change the RGB unit conversion so it's more in a range that it understands as far as what the values represent. And the values you want to use are 0.318. So once we have those values in there, we're going to get our light back into the scene. So the brightness of the sky has been boosted to work with the new exposure node. So now let's go and do that render again. And now we can see we have light in the scene. It does feel like it's a little bit darker, and that has to do with changes we can make on the exposure node. And so once this is done, I can see that if I change the two, obviously the first one is a lot brighter. And so to adjust that, I'll go to my camera, go to the exposure node, and adjust the way I'm exposing the image. So I don't have to make my sun or my sky brighter. I just need to go in here and be like, well, how do I make my, how with a real camera would you adjust exposure? Well, if you lower the f-stop on a camera, the aperture gets bigger, which lets in more light. So I could do that. Or I could adjust shutter speed, or I could adjust the film ISO. And so basically, if I put the film ISO to something like 400 or 800, it gets more sensitive. But since I know that this is a day scene, we're outside with sunlight and a bright blue sky, anybody who knows about cameras would probably know that in that situation you usually would use a film ISO of 100. You don't need to use super sensitive film when it's sunlight because it's very bright. So I would choose to do something that I might normally do, which is to adjust the f-stop. So if I lower it to 12 and do a render, you'll see that it's going to get a little bit brighter. So the way that you're exposing the image, or how bright you get it, becomes a matter of personal preference. So I'm going to go and lower the f-stop a little bit more. I lowered it to 10, so now we're doing another render. So now the brightness is starting to get more into the range of what you expect for normal daylight exposure. And so now that's done, we can compare and see, well, it was, a little bit brighter with the other exposure node. I kind of feel like, yeah, maybe I'm up for it being a little brighter. But then this still leaves the issue of the textures not being gamma corrected. And so basically the issue where I said the greens looked a little richer in hardware than they're looking in our actual render. And so for that, again, that green is very different than this green. So at this point you can see our image has now gotten a little brighter than we were. I feel it's a little too bright. I'll put the f-stop to 9. And now we're going to have to go and gamma correct our textures. So let's just let this finish. Save that. All right. So going into Hypershade, what I need to do is find the shaders that I'm using on these objects. So let's just grab that one to start and map it. So this one has a simple color map, this ramp, that's going into diffuse color. And so what I need to do to gamma correct it is I just need to go to Maya and create a gamma node. And so if we scroll inside here, you will see that you're going to find a node that's called gamma, and that's the one that you want to use. So we'll scroll down until we find it, which is right there, gamma correct. Click it, and now we have this gamma correct node. So instead of the texture going directly into the material, so we can see just mapping diffuse, I'll break those connections. I'll map the ramp into the value on the gamma correct node, and then the output goes into my diffuse. But now I need to tell this gamma node how to gamma correct. And what you're going to do is put 454. And so this is going to basically be assuming a gamma of 2.2 being our target. So the way that these numbers are being figured out is something that you can look online, like I did when I learned this stuff, to find the right numbers, like the 0.318 that goes onto the physical sky node, or the 0.454 that goes on the gamma node. So, but basically for this workflow, that's the number you want to use. So you just memorize it and stick it in. So what's going to happen now is the color that you see here, you can see all of a sudden looks a lot darker or more saturated over here. So it's compensating by getting the color space of the texture into the color space that we're working in for our render, basically. So now that I have that gamma node in there, then we're going to be good for that surface in any scene that has an exposure node in it. If I were to choose to import this shader into a scene that didn't have exposure nodes in it, then I'd end up having to get rid of these gamma nodes. So it's a little bit, annoying to have to do this, but it's a simple step. There are scripts you can get online that will automatically add gamma correct nodes to all the file textures in your scene. So if you have a heavy scene, it's not a big deal. But in here, the scene is relatively simple. So it's not a big deal for me to go in and do this. So again, gamma correct node. This goes to value. That I break. This is going to diffuse. And this is going to 0.454. Then I can grab the next one, map it, and then grab the gamma correct node, break that connection. That's going to value, that's going to diffuse, and that's going to 0.454, 0.454, 0.454. And then finally, our leaves. So in here, the cutout opacity is fine. We don't have to gamma correct that, but we do need to gamma correct this diffuse texture. So let's go to gamma correct, value, diffuse, 0.454. All right. Close this out. Save our scene. Do a render. So the main difference we're going to see has to do with the textures. So you already can probably notice that the textures now in the render look much more like they do on disk. So meaning that when you look at your textures in hardware here, now the problem is that what you're seeing in hardware is gamma corrected, so it made them darker in hardware. But if you can remember what they looked like before that, they did look more like this. So we're getting the correct colors for our textures in this scene. So this is where we were, this is where we are. So clearly that's better. Now we enter the issue of things having to do with reflectivity and translucency. So if I save this image, you can see that the reflectivity that are on these leaves looks a little silly, just because they are highly reflective. So what are some changes we need to make to these shaders? So if we start, let's say, with the simpler things, let's start with the branches. Now, the branches on these shrubs might be, let's say, normal wood, which would not be very translucent, be relatively rough, and would not be very, very reflective, meaning the reflection would be extremely blurry. While something like this rubber plant, you might expect that branch to be something that's more like the actual branches that are within the leaves, meaning that it's a little bit more succulent, a little bit more translucent. So, but for now, let's just assume that they're both kind of like regular wood. I would go to the shader for this one and make a couple changes. So we've already mapped the color, so that's good. But here we see we have weight and roughness. Well, we definitely want the diffuse color to have a strong weight for this, because it's primarily a diffuse type of wood, let's say. You could use a little bit of roughness, which and the shader ball isn't really helping, but it kind of, takes a diffuse shading and sort of spreads it out as if the object is rougher, and it gives you a look that you would get if you had a really sort of high frequency bump map on it. So I could maybe use a little bit of roughness in there. A lot of these things, again, we're not going to be doing really an exhaustive MIA material lecture here. So as I talked about with paint effects, a lot of this stuff, trial and error is the best way to get comfortable with how to use it. So I'm really focusing on the most important things having to do with plants. So then we get to reflection. The reflection color for plants, wood, and so forth is basically white. It reflects the specular highlight, or the reflection, is the same color as the light source. So white is what you would want. You obviously could texture that so the reflectivity is not the same over the entire leaf, but for now we'll just say that it is. So we won't worry about texturing it. But what about reflectivity and glossiness? So let's go and close everything in here. So we can just focus on reflection. So reflection has a couple folders in here. We have reflection and advanced reflection. For this wood, we only need to use the basic reflection settings. So reflectivity and glossiness. Now, be aware that the reflectivity is related to this folder, BRDF. So my reflectivity is at 0.6, although anything on the surface that's facing the camera is only going to get a reflection of 0.2. But that's 20% of 0.6, which is a little confusing. So sometimes I'll start by just putting this to 1, so I really can just use these values. So whatever's facing the camera is 0.2, whatever's turning away from the camera has a reflection of 1. So this is basically like a Fresnel effect. There is a checkbox here called Use Fresnel Reflection, which means that instead of using these sliders, it's going to create the Fresnel effect based on the index of refraction. So, but it's a little bit more intuitive to just use these sliders from an artist perspective to get the look that you want. So for something like wood, where it's facing the camera, it might have a reflection of 0.1, where it's turning away from the camera, it might have a reflection of 0.2, meaning it's very, very low reflectivity. Remember that reflection just means that, light bounces off this thing. And so in general, to create realistic shaders with MIA, it's nice to have a little bit of reflectivity on everything, just like in the real world. In reality, there's no such thing as a specular highlight. Everything is a reflection. And whether the specular highlight is a reflection of the sun, let's say, whether it's a tight highlight or a spread out highlight, has to do with the, according to this material, the glossiness of that surface. So something like chrome or a mirror would have a glossiness of 1. The reflection would be completely in focus. But with something like wood, obviously the glossiness would be really, really low. And if you look at our little preview there, you can see that the highlight gets spread out. So what this is actually doing is it's blurring the reflection. And so I'm going to go and lower the glossiness on this guy, let's say to about, 0.2, very, very low value. So those are my basic settings that I would need in here for that wood. The only other thing that I like to do, that I'm going to do with all of the plants, is turn on ambient occlusion. So obviously this is something that can be rendered as a pass and added into your comp later, so you don't have to build it into the shader. But since the MIA has ambient occlusion, so for this little plant library we're creating, it creates some nice additional shading for us on our plants, on the twigs, branches, and leaves. So, and the default samples and distance are fine. Now also in here, when you lower the glossiness value on your reflection, so you get a blurrier reflection, the samples becomes important. So if your blurry reflections are very blurry by having a low glossiness, the reflection might look a little grainy, and that's where you can use this to reduce that. For test renders, it's a good idea to leave that lower, as it does affect render time. So that's the basics for that material. So if we go to this one, which is, let's say in our example here, it's kind of the same thing, I might use a little bit of roughness, reflectivity up, glossiness really, really low, 0 degree, 0.1, 90 degree, 0.2, a little bit of ambient occlusion, and that's pretty much all I'm worrying about with that guy. Now what about these leaves? Now these leaves we're going to expect to be kind of shiny, especially for a rubber plant. So I'm going to put the reflectivity up, but I don't want the reflection to be completely in focus like we saw in our test render. So I'm going to blur the reflection a little bit on that. Let's say we start at around 0.5. So you can see the highlights spreading out a little bit. Then for this, be aware that this is a single-sided material. Very important to point it out. Or that's not a single-sided material. It's a single-sided, let's say, piece of geometry. There's no thickness to it, right? So if I go inside here and I select some of these faces and zoom in, there's no thickness to the leaves that are created by Paint Effects. So what that means is that there's one side that has the normals pointing out and one side that doesn't. Well, one side is considered to be the outside and one side is the inside. Well, with the MIA material by default, be aware that the reflection is only calculated on one side. So very important for something like these leaves, in the reflection folder, if you go into advanced reflection, there's a checkbox called skip reflection on inside. You want to turn that off so that you get a reflection on both the top and bottom of each leaf. So now let's go in here. What did we do? So we're not making the leaves very rough. We're keeping them smooth, so we have that at 0. We're still having a lot of a diffuse component to this shader. Our reflectivity is high, but we're toning it down by using the BRDF curves. So where it's facing the camera, the reflection, let's say, is low, 0.2, but as it turns away from the camera, maybe the reflection is 0.9. So very bright reflection at glancing angles, which you're going to find on most leaves. You're going to have a pretty big range between 0 degree and 90 degree reflection. So we have reflectivity, glossiness, skip reflection on inside is off. So the only thing we don't have that we know we're going to need for a leaf is translucency, but we'll get to that in a sec. Now let's go to these leaves. Same thing. So I'm going to lower the glossiness down on these also, let's say somewhere around 0.5. Turn off skip reflection on inside because those leaves also have no thickness. Maybe adjust the BRDF curve a little bit. Turn on ambient occlusion for my leaves. I forgot to do that for these leaves, so let's do that as well. And that's pretty much the basic settings as a start point before we get to translucency. So with these changes, save our scene, and let's go render view and do a render. So again, we just make sure you can see these reflections are just too sharp on the leaves right there. So let's render. And now, because of the fact that we have blurry reflections, the render will take a little bit longer. And you'll be able to see that the shading is now getting a little bit nicer on these leaves. You might think that they're too shiny, but that's easily adjusted by going to the BRDF curve and lowering the reflectivity. So, but if we now compare, you can see there's a huge difference between what we have here and what we have here. So really, if you look at these, they're almost completely diffuse. Now we're getting some nice blue lighting coming in from the sky. We can see on these leaves in here as well. So what's looking a little funny on this plant is that we're seeing the bottom side of these leaves. So here we're seeing the top side, but there we're seeing the bottom. The reason it's looking funny or not realistic right now is we haven't gotten to translucency yet. Light should be scattering across these leaves so that the underside of the leaf is illuminated. But what you will notice if we compare the renders is with the glossiness at 1, the reflections are completely sharp. With the glossiness at 0.5, the reflections are getting blurred out. So specularity and reflectivity are a very important part of these shaders. And while you can see with the wood that's inside there, it's kind of matte looking, probably actually is still even almost too shiny for that little wood twig that's inside there. So the next thing to talk about is translucency and how translucency will be incorporated into the MIA material. Once that's in there, then we have everything that we need to start dialing in and making little tweaks to get these leaves to look more natural. So let's go and save our scene and talk about translucency.